What is up, everybody? It is Chai, your professional poker coach, and I want to teach you guys something absolutely amazing. This is going to be one of the best bluffing lines that you've probably never even heard of. And this line has to do with play from the small blind against big blind, which I think is a formation that a lot of poker players struggle with. Of course, people struggle here because ranges are so wide for both players, but luckily, that's also what makes bluffing exceptional. You guys have left so many comments on this video series saying how much you love it, and so I am here to deliver. And today's specific line, playing as small blind versus big blind in single raised pots, is to bet small on the flop, and to then actually bet small again on the turn in order to bluff on the river. If you are tuning into this video series for the very first time, then welcome. There are full-length, 100% free coaching videos on my YouTube channel, so subscribe so you definitely do not miss them. And just recently, I also started a second YouTube channel, which is called Chai Poker Clips. In Chai Poker Clips, I'm just taking a few highlights from the coaching sessions and uploading them. So jumping back into it, the focus of today is the line called bet 30, and then bet 30, and then just bet on the river, right? This means we're betting small on the flop, we're betting small on the turn, and then we're bluffing on the river. Now, this line is terrific with our bluffs, but the bet sizes here are incredibly important. Mass data does show that people will overfold when we bet 3 times as small blind versus big blind, but we really maximize the EV by selecting these very specific small bet sizes, both on the flop and on the turn before bluffing on the river. As a quick table of contents, we will first describe why bluffing here works. We will then talk about a few key concepts when betting, and then we will talk about a few powerful board examples to give you a full comprehensive overview of how to use this line to maximally exploit your opponents. Although I did mention what this line is, I highly suggest that you watch the full video because this line only works when you understand the nuance that goes behind it. Although this video is going to cover so many strategic topics, I have a free follow-up video for you that covers even more important points. In this YouTube video, we're only going to talk about flop and turn play, but river play is also very crucial. In addition, I think there's one very important turn exploit to discuss when playing a small blind versus big blind, and so both of those topics are going to be available on the free video on my website. Definitely get that video delivered to you. I honestly saved some of the best information for that video. But let's start off with the very first point in our table of contents. We will discuss why bluffing in this line works so incredibly well. As I mentioned, this line is specifically to bet small on the flop, to bet small again on the turn, and then to bet on the river. By using these two smaller bet sizes, both on the flop and on the turn, we are maximizing the EV of bluffing. I think understanding why reveals a few central concepts in poker that will help you play better in small blind versus big blind, but also in a variety of other spots. In my view, there are 3 main reasons why this line works so well. And of course, I'm not just guessing here. Mathematically, this is going to be the best line for bluffing as small blind versus big blind. The very first reason why I think bluffing here works exceptionally well is because both players' ranges are really wide in blind versus blind. I think a lot of people really struggle with blind versus blind play because they're not sure how to play a lot of weak hands when their range is very wide. If we just take a look at the pre-flop ranges very quickly, small blind should be opening something that looks like this. A lot of people definitely don't even have a pre-flop calling range, so they will just open all of these hands. And then big blind also has to play a very wide range with tons of weak hands like 9-3 suited, 7-3 suited, 8-4 suited, and so many more. What's really important to keep in mind is that in mass data, when our opponent's range is wide, they will overfold more. So what's happening when we're betting small on the flop and betting small on the turn is we're forcing our opponent to defend a ton of weak hands, which we'll see in just a second, both on the flop and on the turn. The next point worth mentioning is that our opponent is actually playing in position. A lot of people might think because we're playing out of position, bluffing would be a little bit worse, but you have to keep in mind that when your opponent is in position, they have to call more hands. So for example, if we are betting on the flop, because our opponent is in position, they are priced in to call many weak hands versus this small bet. Because they're playing in position, they are only allowed to fold 26.5% of the time, and they have to frequently defend with very, very weak hands like 9-3 suited versus this flop c-bet. I think a lot of people are going to fold 9-3 suited. If our opponent was out of position, they would have to defend with far fewer hands. Maybe their folding frequency in this spot would be something like 28 or 29%. As I mentioned earlier, our opponents really struggle to find a lot of weak hands like 9-3 and 9-4, and so mass data does show that when our opponent is the in-position player, they will actually fold more versus bluffs. And the final point worth mentioning is that bluffing here works exceptionally well because we can often bet small both on the flop and on the turn. Specifically in small blind versus big blind, our flop strategy in the solver is quite often to use this small bet size, and then the solver also likes using a lot of small bets on the turn. You can see that this is actually the most common bet size to use on this 6 of clubs turn. This is a pretty important exploitative point, especially versus good opponents. In poker, we always have to try to play a little bit close to the solver strategy in order to not give away too much information about what we're doing. I think a lot of people default to using something like 75% of the pot on turns like these, and this is a pretty big mistake. When you're using a 75% pot size bet, not only are you missing out on this very important exploit, but your strategy is honestly just very face up. If you're using 75% of the pot and you're playing against me, I know you're just betting your top pairs plus. I know you're going to be checking a lot of your weaker hands. And so as the in position player, I'm just going to bet really big with my top pairs and crush that strategy. This isn't really the subject of today's video, but I just want to point out that when we are allowed to use a small bet size in solvers, it is much more difficult to counter our highly exploitative strategy, and therefore it performs better versus very good opponents. Because the solver likes using a small bet size on the flop and on the turn, in blind versus blind, I think this is just such an amazing exploit that you really have to know. Next up, let's just talk about a few key concepts when taking this line, and afterwards we'll just dive into a few different board examples to really give you a comprehensive overview of when to use this exploit. We already mentioned this first point, but just to repeat it, betting small mathematically maximizes the EV of bluffing in this line. And in order to really conceal our strategy, we have to know where to bet small. I just mentioned that the solver likes betting small on a lot of turns as blind versus blind, but there are certainly some turns where that bet size is almost never used. We just have to be aware of what those turns are in order to not make that mistake of betting small versus more knowledgeable opponents who will then figure out what we're doing. So very, very important. We have to know where the solver likes to bet small on the turn. A few more key concepts when betting are related to the fact that we are playing out of position. The first point is that when we are playing out of position, our checking range always has to be protected. When we look at how the solver plays on a few turns, we just have to keep in mind that a lot of the strategy is designed around protecting a checking range. Essentially, what this really means is that when we are playing out of position, we will often bet a lot of very weak hands for a smaller bet size, and identifying which hand class likes to bet small is going to be key for understanding where the solver likes to bet small. We'll touch a little bit more about this later, so don't worry if it sounds too technical right now. The next key point is that when we are playing out of position, our small bet range also has to be protected. This is very important because we will take a look at a few turn spots where it makes a lot of sense for us to have an overbet range and to have a small bet range. So some of our hands will want to bet very big, and other hands in our range will want to bet small. I know a lot of poker players like using just one bet size on the turn, but just because this exploit is so insanely profitable, I think it makes sense to introduce a smaller bet size on many different turns. When we use two bet sizes and we have a small betting range, we have to ensure that some of our stronger hands will bet small. If we're playing versus the same opponent over and over again, and we only ever bet small with weak hands, that becomes very suspicious very, very fast. A lot of people who have access to mass data also know that smaller bets tend to be unprotected, and therefore they will raise a lot versus those small bets. You just have to make sure that you're not playing into this pattern so that better opponents don't have a very easy time exploiting you. And with that said, let's get right into the meat of this video. We're going to look at a few powerful board examples that will illustrate how to use this line effectively. As I mentioned just now, our key focus will be finding turns where the solver likes to bet small. If the solver likes to bet small in the turn, then we can definitely take this line, but if the solver doesn't, then we're probably better off just using whatever size the solver prefers. We're going to dissect the flop and turn strategy on 4 different boards. The first one will be Queen 10 4-3, which is just a neutral high board. The second one is King King 10 Ace, which is a high connected paired board that I think is very tricky. The third one is 7-3 Deuce Rainbow with a Queen turn overcard. I think a lot of people struggle playing out of position when the turn is an overcard. And the final one is 9-7-5-8, which is a very connected low flop and turn. Now, because the key focus for today is finding turns where the solver likes to bet small, I have a quiz for you. And the quiz is to pause the video right now and comment down below on which of these four boards you think the solver will bet small on the turn. So assuming that we bet on the flop, will the turn bet small on this one? What about this one? And what about the final one here? On some of these turns, the solver will not bet small, so comment down below which one you think is which. And to further make it entertaining for you guys, I have a grading system for you. If you answered 0 correctly, you get a frowny face. Answered 1 correctly, then you are a 50 NL crusher. If you answered 2 right, it's a 100 NL crusher. 3 right, 500 NL. And if you got all 4 correct, then you are a 1000 NL plus crusher. So stay tuned for the rest of the video to figure out how the solver plays on the turn. Before we move on, in addition to that powerful follow-up video that's on my website, I actually have 2 freebies out for you guys. The very first freebie, which is linked down below, is going to be my 3 data-driven exploits guide that work anywhere between 10 NL to 1000 NL online. I've created a free guide discussing 3 powerful exploits, and not only do I discuss what those are, I actually spend time discussing why they work and how to adapt them to your own game. The next freebie I have is my modular warm-up builder. I've mentioned this before. Most poker players are aware that their mental game is the biggest thing that is holding them back, but very few people actually work diligently on it. This warm-up builder is the very first step. By creating a modular warm-up builder for you, I have taken all of the difficult work out of the equation. All you have to do is just get that guide, select one of the building blocks for every single step, and then use it consistently to see amazing results. Those are linked down below. Check those out. Okay, so let's dive right into our very first board. This is Queen 10-4, 3 Rainbow. We're going to first discuss the flop strategy and talk about a few concepts before moving on to play on the turn. On Queen 10-4, 3 Rainbow, our flop strategy in the solver is to bet 30% of the pot around 70% of the time. Here's what this roughly looks like. You can see that as small blind versus big blind, we still definitely have a pretty big range advantage because there are these 2 high cards on the flop. And when we're playing out of position, our general strategy on all 3 streets will be a little bit more merged. Essentially, when we compare this to the flop c-bet strategy for button versus big blind, when we are playing as the in-position pre-flop raiser, in this blind versus blind spot, we are far more interested in betting our weaker hands like 10-9 suited, 10-8 suited, our weaker top pairs, and those hands often prefer a smaller bet size. When we're playing out of position, we have to ensure that our checking range is not super weak. When we are playing in position, we can definitely just polarize on a lot of boards and check back these hands very, very often. But when we're out of position, that becomes a lot trickier to do. If we're checking something like 10-6 as out of position, we are still going to have to go through the in-position player in order to see the turn. So if we check with 10-6, our opponent still has the opportunity to bet very often. Hands like 10-6 and 10-5 really just want to go to showdown as cheaply as possible. And by betting these hands for a small bet size, we are sort of setting the price to see the next street. We're definitely going to get raised sometimes by our opponent's stronger hands, but those hands like Queen 10 are going to bet anyways if we check. By betting small, however, we are on average seeing the next street for a cheaper price, and we're also getting called by worse sometimes. Right, our opponent is always going to call with their third pairs on this flop, so we can see the next street for a fairly low price and still get a little bit of value from our opponent's range. This same concept applies on the turn, although on the turn, strategies will naturally be a little bit more polarized, as we'll see later on in this video. Let's break the strategy down by hand class, however. We'll start with our very strongest hands. And of course, this is just to give you guys a very broad overview of how the solver plays and not information that you should really fully memorize. The whole point of this is to have a very good, but not incredibly precise idea of what the solver is doing on a number of different boards. And that's going to be your rough baseline. Of course, in poker, we always want to play a little bit more exploitatively. And so it's necessary for us to deviate from that baseline in accordance with some good bluffing or value betting principles. Just going back to our strongest hands, you can see that our 2 pairs plus are betting around 80% of the time. Our overpairs are also betting 80% of the time, so are our top pairs. And what's very important to note is that on the flop, we are always slow playing some of our strongest hands. Let's see this in action. We're going to highlight our sets, our 2 pairs, and our top pairs. Here you can see that all of these hands are betting at roughly the same frequency. We're definitely betting hands like pocket kings a little bit more than queen 3, but this is a very small difference of around 20% in the checking frequency. So in general, most of these strong hands are betting roughly 80% of the time. This is pretty important because this highlights a key difference between out of position play and in position play. Again, if we were playing as button versus big blind, as the in position preflop raiser, you would see that ace queen is betting pretty much always, whereas queen 3 or queen 2 is only betting maybe 30 or 40% of the time. As I just mentioned, when we are playing out of position, we always have to make sure we don't have an exposed checking range by betting a lot of these hands, and we also have to protect whatever checking range we do have. And just like we have to protect our small betting range by betting ace queen small sometimes, we also have to protect our checking range by checking with ace queen sometimes. A nice heuristic to memorize is that if you just want to bet all of these hands at the exact same frequency on these sorts of boards, you will be performing more than fine. Let's now talk about our weaker hands. These are our second pairs and low pairs. Second pairs will only bet around 60% of the time, and low pairs will only bet around 50% of the time. I do have some additional notes here. Our stronger second pairs will bet a bit more often, and our weaker low pairs will bet a bit more often. Let's just go ahead and highlight those hands: under pairs, second pairs, third pairs, and low pairs. When we're looking at our second pairs, this is going to be primarily our 10x. You will see that hands like ace 10 are betting a bit more often than 10-5. And when we're looking at our third pairs, you will see that hands like pocket 3s and pocket 2s are betting a little bit more often than pocket 7s. Just like with the strong hands, we can wrap our heads around this very easily once we understand the concept. Now, I think what's happening here is best explained when we think about the showdown value of various hands. Let's just draw out a gradient of second pairs all the way through third pairs. And obviously, our stronger second pairs are going to have a little bit more showdown value than our very weakest third pair, which is pocket 2s here. Now, although we are playing out of position and we are generally interested in playing a merged strategy, there is a point somewhere along this line where our hand has the right amount of showdown value to just check. Remember that hands like 10-6 can definitely bet small and get called by worse, but when we get down into like this pocket 7s or pocket 6s, it becomes a little bit more difficult for us to get called by worse hands very often. So anything to the left of this middle line is just going to bet a little bit more often because it is a little bit stronger. Now, to the right of this line, we have a lot of weak hands. And the nice thing about betting weaker hands a bit more often is that we can either deny a little bit more equity, or we can actually get stronger hands to fold. So by betting something like pocket 2s, we're obviously protecting our hand a bit more than if we're betting pocket 7s. But also, if not on the flop, at the very least on the turn, we can get our opponent to fold stronger hands. So it's a bit easier to think of these hands as bluffs. Our bluffs are usually going to be pretty indifferent between betting or checking, but our medium strength hands are going to have a strong preference for checking. Therefore, we do see that when the hand gets a bit weaker, it will bet a bit more often. On the turn, this becomes a lot more apparent, but even when you're playing out of position, you will usually have some sort of middle point where your hand has just the right amount of showdown value to prefer checking. On the flop, our strategy will always be more merged, so that's why you don't see a very clear checking range. But on the turn, and especially on the river, even though you're out of position, you will often have a hand class that only wants to check and never bets. So when you're doing some drills or looking at some solutions, try to identify where that middle point is for the out of position player, and that's going to make life a lot easier. Moving on, let's talk about our bluffs. Very simple instruction here. Our bluffs are betting 70% of the time with connected or low showdown value priority, right? Prio just means priority. Same thing as before, let's highlight those hands. It's going to be our ace highs, our king highs, and our no mate hands, and you can see this pattern in effect. Pretty much every hand class besides ace 8 or ace 7 is bluffing at a high frequency, but obviously our more connected hands will prefer to bluff a bit more often. This is something like jack 9 or king jack, and even king 9 and other hands as well. We also generally prefer to bluff hands with less showdown value. So 6-5 is a much better bluffing candidate than ace 8 offsuit, really for the same reason that I just discussed with our second pairs and low pairs. Ace 8 has a bit more showdown value, so it's a bit closer to like that middle point, whereas 6-5 can get a lot of stronger overcards to fold, so it really likes bluffing. It's a fairly simple pattern, but I really do think you just have to do some drills to really get this down. The difference between something like 8-5 and 7-5, in my opinion, really does not matter here, but the difference between 6-5 and ace 8 offsuit definitely does. If you want, you can just start off with like a 50% baseline betting frequency, and then increase that to 80 or 90% if the hand is very connected, or decrease it down to 10% or maybe even 0% if you're holding something that has very bad bluffing qualities like ace 8 or ace 7 does. There's no hard and fast rule, but honestly, once you just do some drills, this becomes incredibly simple. But now let's talk about that turn play. Assume we bet small on the flop, and big blind simply called our bet, and the turn was the 3 of clubs. Recall that our key theoretical concept for this video is to identify turns where small blind will double barrel for a small bet size quite often. So the question I have for you guys is, on the 3 of clubs turn, will small blind bet small? I feel like I've said the word small a million times in this video already, but pause the video, try it out, and then unpause when you're ready. And the answer to this one is, drumroll please, it's no. Just looking at how the solver plays, a small bet size is never used. Instead, we are overbetting, even using 275% of the pot. It's definitely a very big bet size. Maybe I'll make a separate video about overbetting, because I think overbetting is just so damn fun. Okay, but let's figure out why the solver is not using a small bet size on this specific turn. I have a note written down here, which says that our range is too polarized and weaker hands do not benefit very much from betting. By the way, if you guys want to get this PowerPoint to just save all of these notes, that is available on my Discord. So let's analyze this turn to figure out what's happening here. And I actually think that the strategy is best explained by one key concept. And that concept is the fact that we have way too many strong hands and not enough weak hands. This is pretty crucial because the only time we ever want to bet small on the turn is going to be when we have an abundance of weak hands that prefer to bet small. As I discussed before, there are many more reasons why we want to use a small bet size when we're playing out of position, but there are still going to be a few turns where we overwhelmingly have way too many strong hands for the small bet size to ever make sense. You can kind of see that the solver is trying to carve out a betting range with some of these weaker top pairs, but it's really not working out. I talked about this in one of my previous videos, but there is typically a pretty big cost associated with protecting weaker hands in our range. If we're betting queen 6 or queen 7, then we have to use a small bet size, and then our strongest hands also have to use that smaller bet size in order to protect those hands. That is pretty expensive because naturally our stronger hands just really want to bet big in order to go all in by the river. The default strategy the solver will use will be this very polarized turn betting strategy, and only when you have a lot of weak hands that are interested in betting will the solver use a smaller bet size. In this case, you're just not that interested in betting your weaker top pairs or your second pairs. The 10 is a pretty important card because it is fairly high up and our opponent just doesn't have a lot of overcards that they will fold versus the small bet. This is known as making a protection bet, and although betting for protection is a little bit more important on the flop because there are 2 turn cards left to come, it still can apply to the turn, and it's definitely going to be one force that can push the solver a bit more towards using that small bet size. But here, because you can't get protection, the force is not that strong, and you just have a big range advantage, so the solver likes to bet big and overbet on the turn with the intention to jam on the river. If you found this tricky, definitely comment down below, and I might make a follow-up video explaining out of position play a bit more in depth. I do think I explained it quite well though. Let's move on to our next board. This is our high paired connected board, King, King, 10, Ace. Starting with the flop strategy, the solver will bet 30% of the pot 70% of the time. So starting with our strongest hands, our 2 pairs plus will bet around 80% of the time, and we'll still slow play some of them, just like we did before. The note I have here is that our over pairs on the flop are betting only 60% of the time, but this is because we're only holding pocket aces on the flop, so this one doesn't really matter. Our second pairs and low pairs are now betting around 70% of the time, with the stronger ones again betting more if it's a second pair, and weaker betting more if it is a low pair. Let's take a look at this. We're going to highlight the strongest hands first, and then we'll take a look at those weaker pairs. Just like before, our strongest hands, which are our trips, are all betting roughly at the same frequency. Ace-king is betting just as often as king-2 is. Strongest hands will obviously check raise at a very high frequency, so definitely think about doing that very often, even if your betting frequency is very high on the flop. Next up, let's just highlight those weaker pairs. Under pairs, second pairs, and third pairs are all betting around 70% of the time. But definitely this board is a bit different from that previous one. I talked about this several times in my previous videos in this series, but on paired boards, it's very difficult for players to connect with the flop. Especially in small blind versus big blind, both players have very wide ranges that miss this board. As a result, if you're thinking about that graphic from earlier, where the middle of our range really preferred to check, that middle is going to be at a much lower point now, if that makes sense. We can still identify it by seeing which hands prefer to check. In this case, it's going to be 10-5 or 10-4, which I suppose on this specific board is still fairly high because higher cards are always going to be a little bit easier for both players to interact with. But especially if this was a lower paired board like 7-7 deuce, the middle of the range would even be like middle ace highs. It wouldn't necessarily be the strongest ace highs. And so just to demonstrate that, this is 7-7 deuce rainbow. You can see that our strongest ace highs are actually betting for value on the flop. And then the middle of the range is around ace 9, ace 8, king 10, king 9. So this definitely does demonstrate that the middle portion of that range, which prefers to check, will vary a lot depending on what the specific board height is. On lower boards, both players will miss a lot more. Therefore, weaker pocket pairs and pairs in general will just be quite valuable. Looking at our bluffs, the heuristic is still the same as on the previous board. We're betting around 70% of the time with connected or low showdown value priority. Let's just highlight those hands. You can see that the overall betting frequency with them is around 70%, but hands that are a little bit more connected, like Queen 9, Jack 9, are betting a bit more often. And of course, we are also betting hands like 6-5, still a lot more often than we're betting ace 8 or ace 7. It's definitely pretty easy to remember. And of course, remember on the lower paired boards like 7-7 deuce rainbow, that sort of middle portion of our range is going to be a little bit lower. So just be aware of that when you're c-betting on the flop. Okay, and so now that we understand how different hand classes play on the flop, my question to you is, do you think the solver will bet small after c-betting on the flop on the ace of diamonds turn? Just think about what the general strategy for small blind will be on the turn, and if a small bet size will be part of it. I think one useful way of thinking about it is to actually identify a hand class that might prefer to bet small. So on the flop, we know that the bulk of our value range are going to be hands like the weak trips. There's going to be a lot of pairs that make it into the betting range as well. And do those hands want to check, or do they want to bet big, or do they want to bet small on the turn? And if there's a lot of hands that want to bet small, then typically a small bet size will be preferred. So again, pause the video, comment down below if you think the solver bets small here. And let's answer that question. Drum roll, please. Yes. On the turn, we do bet small. The explanation for this is the fact that we have many weak trips and weak flushes in our range, which do like to use this bet size on the turn, and that sort of overpowers the need for us to overbet and build the pot quickly. We can see this in action here. So if we sort by hand class, you will see that the stronger flushes and the full houses are definitely interested in overbetting and then betting very big again on the river. But there are plenty of hands like weaker flushes and straights and a lot of that king X, which just isn't strong enough to make it into the overbet size, but still likes to bet. The same concepts from before definitely apply here. We are playing out of position, and so it would be detrimental for us to just check with these trips always, which is why the solver arrives at this very, very specific strategy. Now, In practice, this spot can be a little bit tricky because you can see that the solver will primarily use 2 bet sizes on this turn. It's using an overbet size and then of course that small bet. Here, I think you could go one of 2 ways. I think you can just simplify your strategy and choose 1 bet size, in which case you'd probably want to bet small, especially because that works out very well exploitatively. But it's also more than fine to use both bet sizes on this specific turn. You can see that there is a clear division in terms of the strategy that the solver wants to use with different hand classes, and so it's nice to approximate that as a part of a broader overall strategy. We know that betting small on the flop and then on the turn is going to be very, very good for bluffing, but obviously that makes it not so good for value betting. If we want to simplify our strategy to just 1 bet size and we go with this one, then our strong hands are going to miss out on a lot of value. If we want to use 2 bet sizes, what we could do is put a little bit more of our strong hands into that overbet and a little bit more of our weaker hands and our bluffs into that small bet. This could be our main bluffing line, and then the bottom one going overbet on the turn would be our main value betting line. Of course, we want to avoid making the mistake of never value betting for that small size and never bluffing for the big bet size, because good opponents will pick up on that very, very quickly, and they know precisely how to exploit that. Versus very good opponents, it is absolutely vital to mix up your strategy. Doing this effectively can definitely be a little bit complex, however. My general thought process for mixing bet sizes is something that I talk about in my private coaching with students, but if you're interested in this, I'm definitely not opposed in discussing how to do this in a YouTube video. But that's pretty much what's happening here in the solver, and exploitatively, you likely want to just bet a bit more often for that smaller bet size with many of your bluffs. So if we highlight the low pairs and no made hands, you can see that many of these hands are mixing on the turn, and I think it's more than fine to just always bet Jack 9 for a small bet, always bet Queen 9 for a small bet, or if you're playing versus a good opponent, to use a small bet most of the time with this hand, and still sometimes overbet with it. In essence, when you have such a good bluffing line, you want to figure out how to use it very often, but not get exposed. One good way of doing that is to identify which hands would like to bet anyways, and then just increase their betting frequency. It's also more than fine to just have some random bluffs like 8-5 or 9-5, especially versus weaker opponents, because those people will not know how to effectively counter this strategy. The danger of betting a lot of random hands like 9-7 and 9-6 isn't the fact that they are not ever betting in the solver, it's the fact that if we bet all of these hands, then our overall betting frequency would be absolutely massive. We would be betting maybe like 60% of the time if we would always bet these hands, and if we're playing against a good opponent, obviously they know that that betting range is going to be way too weak, and they're going to raise often, they're not going to fold very much, in which case this line is quite awful. But weak opponents might not necessarily know how often you're able to bet on the turn anyways, and so if you're playing someone who is a little bit newer to the game, then definitely don't be afraid to start betting sometimes with 9-7 or 8-6, or just any of these weaker hands in general. If you take a look at how big blind should defend versus this small bet, I think it becomes very obvious why people are folding so much here. On the flop, we know that their folding frequency was only like 25%, and again, on the turn, they are not allowed to fold any more often than that. Versus this specific line, they're supposed to call quite often with tons of weak hands like pocket sixes, pocket fives, pocket fours, etc., and they will also have to defend these hands very often on the river. The fact that the defending threshold is this low makes it quite improbable that weak opponents will exploit us. Even if they suspect that we're betting way too often on the turn, they might not necessarily feel like they should still call with pocket fives or pocket fours, because these hands obviously look very weak on king, king, 10, ace. Good opponents will definitely call with these hands, in my opinion, if they feel like you're betting way too often for this small bet size on the turn, or at the very least, they will raise with these hands. And hopefully this highlights my general thought process for tailoring the exploit based on my opponent's level of skill. Next up, let's take a look at 7-3 deuce queen. This was our low flop with that turn overcard. And right away, you can notice that things are a little bit different from the previous case studies. On the flop, we are now using a 75% pot size bet, only 40% of the time. This is very important to at least know. In small blind versus big blind, you will usually c-bet for only a very small bet size, but on low disconnected boards, the solver will still prefer a more medium size. Your weaker hands are still definitely very interested in betting, but the weaker hands like the ace-3 and king-3 are actually kind of strong on this board. This really is an exception to the general rule of using a small flop c-bet size, but be aware that it exists. Let's talk about hand classes. 2 pairs plus are betting around 60% of the time, over pairs are betting 50% of the time, with weaker ones betting more, and top pairs are betting around 50% of the time. The strong hands are pretty self-explanatory. The sets are just betting and, still sometimes slow playing, as we discussed. The top pairs are all betting roughly at the same frequency, as we discussed. But it's very important to note that the over pairs will bet a little bit more if they are a lower rank. Pocket eights definitely benefits more from protection than pocket kings, so this hand just bets more often. Next up, let's look at our weaker pairs. Second pairs are betting 50% of the time, and low pairs are betting 30% of the time. So as we saw, the under pairs and second pairs here are definitely still quite strong because both players' ranges are very wide, and it's quite difficult to connect with 7-3 deuce rainbow. So hands like ace-3, king-3 are just betting, but especially when we get down to these third pairs, this is kind of like that medium showdown value midpoint that we discussed earlier that prefers to check. So when we highlight all of these hands, you'll see that they're betting still at a very decent frequency, but the weaker ones are checking a little bit more because they're right in the middle between our stronger hands and our bluffs. Next up, let's look at our bluffs. These hands are betting 40% of the time with connected or low overcard priority. This is a little bit different from before, so let's break it down. I'm just going to highlight our bluffs, and of course, because the overall betting frequency is lower, we are betting them only around 40% of the time, whereas in the previous case studies, we would bet them around 70% of the time. The priority is also a little bit different. If we just want to go with a 75% pot size bet, the primary bluffs in our range really come from this region. These hands are both connected, but they also have overcards. Overcards are very important because it is very powerful to have the ability to turn or river a new top pair. As a result, you will see that overcards that are a little bit less connected will bet more often than maybe some weaker, more connected holdings. I think a good example that demonstrates this is 9-8 versus 8-6. Both of them have equal chance to make a straight on the turn and on the river, but 9-8 has 2 overcards, whereas 8-6 only has 1, and as a result, you will see that 9-8 bets a little bit more often. So definitely prioritize bluffing with weak overcards. Of course, your stronger overcards will frequently have the necessary amount of showdown value to just check, but anything that's a little bit weaker than this point bets quite often. Now, before we move on to the turn strategy, I want to discuss one very important point. Hopefully, some of you guys have already realized this, but this specific exploit that we're talking about in this video only occurs after we bet small on the flop. So it's bet 30 and then bet 30 again on the turn and then bet on the river. But the solver prefers to use a 75% pot size bet here. This exploit of bluffing for 3 streets will thus not work quite effectively here if we choose to use the solver strategy on the flop. Therefore, the only way for us to maximally exploit our opponents is to deviate from the solver strategy and instead use a small bet size on this flop. In my opinion, it's more than fine to just use the smaller bet size, especially versus weaker opponents. Just because the solver likes to bet 75% of the pot here, it doesn't mean you should. By understanding the theoretical baseline and also understanding the exploitative incentives, we can actually make this exploitative adjustment. The nice thing about flop play is that we can usually select what strategy we want to go with within reason and not lose too much EV. But when we have a really nice understanding of which exploits are available, then we can actually gain a lot of EV by selecting that strategy. So maybe there is a cost in theory to play exploitatively and use a small c-bet on the flop instead of a bigger one, but that cost is outweighed by the massive benefit of taking this key exploit. Versus everyone but the very, very best opponents, I would thus probably use a small flop c-bet and bet anywhere between 60 to 70% of the time, and still follow the general principles of sometimes slow play my strongest hands, find that medium showdown value checking range, and prioritize overcards when bluffing. So now that we have that out of the way, let's assume that we bet small on the flop, our opponent calls, and the turn is the queen of hearts. Same question. On the turn, does the solver bet small as small blind? Pause the video and comment down below what you think. And the answer to this one is yes. The solver does use a small bet size sometimes on this turn. You can see that again, it's defaulting to 2 bet sizes. This is the very big overbet that it prefers with the stronger top pairs and the overpairs. And then the weaker bet size is preferred by weaker top pairs, as well as under pairs and second pairs. So really what is happening here is you have an abundance of hands which got devalued because of that queen overcard. These are your former top pairs, like ace7, king7, jack7, etc. A lot of your overpairs also get devalued because your opponent makes a lot of new strong top pairs. These weaker top pairs in your range are actually quite strong, but they bet small in order to protect the weaker hands that you do want to bet small with. And of course, the reason why you're interested in betting all of these hands again on the turn is because you want to ensure that your checking range is not incredibly weak, and you can still definitely get a little bit of denial and thin value by betting them. You just have an abundance of weaker hands on this turn, and therefore the solver likes using the small bet very, very often. The important point here worth mentioning is the fact that the betting frequency is much higher on this turn compared to the previous one. The previous board we looked at was king 10 with the ace overcard, and it's quite clear that you can't really bet for denial on this turn. And in general, both players are going to have pretty strong ranges that have a lot of trips and that have a lot of top pairs. On 7-3 deuce queen, however, both players' ranges are going to be significantly weaker, and you can still bet for denial. Therefore, the overall betting frequency is very high. This is absolutely crucial when you're bluffing, because your goal is to increase the betting frequency for that small bet. You're trying to bet more often with your bluffs in order to exploit your opponents and not less often. In order to accomplish that, you need to know how often the solver bets in general. And so being able to recognize the difference between this turn as well as the king 10 ace one is very important. On king 10 ace, we saw that our weaker bluffs like 8-5 and 8-6 would never bet, and therefore it is probably a good idea to only bet them versus very weak opponents. But on this specific board, you're supposed to bluff very often with all sorts of hands. In order for you to effectively exploit your opponents, you need to recognize that the betting frequency is very high, and thus always bluff with hands like 9-5 of hearts, always bluff with hands like 6-5, and even if you were to start bluffing all the time with weak hands like 10-4 or 10-5, your overall betting frequency wouldn't be increasing all that much, and so that's probably the way you actually do want to play versus most opponents. Just as a quick summary, we really love betting small on this turn because there are so many weaker top pairs, under pairs, and second pairs that prefer that bet size. So bet very often with your weak hands, bet very often with your bluffs, and don't be afraid to bluff at a high frequency on the river. And last but not least, let's take a look at our low connected board. This is 9-7-5-8. On the flop, we are not betting very often as small blind versus big blind. In fact, we are only betting around 30% of the time for that small bet size. We can see the strategy right here. It's important to understand that the solver is betting for a smaller size on this connected board compared to the disconnected board that we saw just earlier. On the previous board, 7-3 deuce, we had a lot of strength with our second pairs, with our top pairs, and our overpairs. But because the board is a lot more connected here, all of those hands get devalued. Therefore, that average bet size is significantly lower. Most semi-connected low boards are going to play very similarly as small blind versus big blind, and if the board is incredibly connected, like 7-6-5, then the solver will prefer to just check and never bet in general. Playing out of position, a lot of people will just check all the time on this flop, which I think is probably fine, but still, if you want to take this exploitative line of betting small on the flop and on the turn, I think it's definitely a decent idea to bet here sometimes. At least if the board is not too connected like this one. Strongest hands are still going to play very intuitively. The overall strategy is going to resemble the one we just saw on 7-3 deuce rainbow, but the betting frequency is lower. Two pairs are only betting 50% of the time. Over pairs are also only betting 50% of the time. Again, the weaker ones are betting a bit more for protection, and the top pairs are only betting 40% of the time. Things differ quite a lot when we look at second pairs or low pairs, however. On the previous case study, these hands were betting, I believe, around 40% of the time, but now that frequency has dropped all the way to 20 and even 10%. This again highlights that concept that we talked about earlier with the whole medium strength hand thing. On 7-3 deuce, our second pairs were maybe about this strong, so they preferred to bet sometimes still. But here on 9-7-5, the second pairs and third pairs are really just in the middle, and so they always prefer to check. You can see that Queen 7, Jack 7 is never betting without a flush draw, and all of this 5x really just wants to check and get to showdown as cheaply as possible. Bluffs are also a little bit different from that previous example. Here, bluffs are only betting around 20% of the time with a strong connected priority. The previous frequency was around 40%. Obviously, this goes down because we're betting less often in general, but we are also really prioritizing very connected combos. On 7-3 deuce, everything was very disconnected, and so we just prefer to bluff with our very best overcards. But on 9-7-5, especially because the betting frequency is so low, we can actually choose to be far more selective when it comes to bluffing. We still do prioritize having 2 overcards compared to only 1 overcard, but in general, you will see that we are only really bluffing when there is connectivity. So King 8 is definitely betting a lot, Queen 8 is betting a lot, but King Queen and King Jack aren't really betting if they don't have at least a backdoor flush draw. And very importantly, weaker bluffs like King 4 and King 3 are never betting without a flush draw. If you really want to exploit your opponents, I think what you could do is try to bluff with a lot of your best combos a bit more often, and you'll probably end up betting around 50% of the time on the flop as a result. If you're really trying to exploit your opponents, you should probably just bring up the frequency with your King 8 or Queen 8 instead of betting with your total nonsense like King 4 or King 3. If you were always betting these hands and always betting these hands, you'd end up betting on the flop way too often. And it's pretty obvious that this board is a little bit more favorable for the pre-flop caller, so people are just going to start raising you a lot. With that said, let's talk about the turn. We bet small, big blind calls, and the turn is the pesky 8 of spades. Do you think small blind is going to bet small? And if it does, what hand class prefers to bet small? Go ahead, pause the video, and let me know down below what you think. Hopefully you did that. Let us check it out. On this turn, the solver does indeed bet small. In fact, it is only using a small bet and never really overbetting. The reason why the solver doesn't overbet here is because most of our flop value range gets devalued on that 8 of spades turn. A lot of those hands still prefer to bet small, which is why we are using that size. We can see this very clearly here. Our top pairs, our over pairs, our 2 pairs, and even our sets really become quite weak on this turn. Top pairs and over pairs just prefer to bet small in order to control the pot. And I guess hands like 2 pairs and sets can get a little bit of thin value by betting small because they're still at least a little bit strong. We definitely have a lot of straights, but even the weaker ones just prefer to bet small, and so that's why our strategy is the way that it is. Although this turn feels very daunting for a lot of people when they're playing a small blind versus big blind, I think this is actually a very decent spot for you to exploit your opponents by taking this line. You'll prioritize a lot of connected hands when bluffing, just like you did on the flop. So hands like ace queen of clubs are betting, ace jack is betting, and queen jack is betting, but your opponent actually still has to defend very wide after you make this bet. Looking at their defending range, they're still only allowed to fold 22% of the time, which means that they have to call very often with second pairs, third pairs, and even low pairs. A lot of these hands will have to hero call versus a river bet. As long as you don't bet way too often on this turn, I think you can safely take that bet exploit and really punish your opponents for not finding enough weak calls. And that's about it for this portion of the YouTube video. I hope you guys enjoyed that really deep dive into this specific exploitative line. And don't forget, on my website, I have a follow-up video. The follow-up video is packed with what I think is some of the most important information, including crucial river play, as well as an important turn exploit. Follow the link down below to see that video now.